Welcome in for another episode of the Silver and Blue podcast. I believe that we are at episode 53 since we started this podcast last spring. And this is our first podcast of the 2023 off season. I guess technically our Niners post game pod was technically an off season podcast, but we're getting into some off season news. Unfortunately aren't any more Cowboys games to talk about as we're sitting here about 2 weeks from the Super Bowl, which will be between the Eagles and the Chiefs. So, a lot of stuff to talk about, though. You know, it is the off season, but this is by no means the dead part of the off season. There's all sorts of moves going around the league right now with coaching changes, and Cowboys are pretty much front and center of that right now, at least locally. In terms of both coordinators, some pretty surprising stuff went on. We'll start with Dan Quinn. I don't know about you, Corey. We hadn't really had this discussion at all just because we're talking about the games and stuff. But I personally had just kind of assumed Dan Quinn was going to be a head coach somewhere else next year. He had several interviews with several of the openings. I didn't pay it much mind in my head, just like, oh, who's going to be the DC next year? Or like, is Dan Quinn going to be able to build on this? I just assumed he was gone, basically. So really surprising news that Dan Quinn was back. Were you surprised by that as well?
Yeah, I definitely was. I like you. Hadn't really given it much thought to Dan Quinn being back. I obviously knew he was fond of his time here in Dallas, but anytime a head coaching opportunity comes up, you expect a guy like Dan Quinn to be at the head of a lot of these head coaching searches. And it just appeared that wasn't the case. He kind of saw the writing on the wall with the jobs in Arizona, most likely going to Brian Flores. Of course, the news comes down today that Sean Payton's going to Denver. And then forgot the other
D'Amico
one.
Ryans.
D'Amico Ryan going to Houston. And then there was one other job that I feel like he was maybe a candidate for. Maybe it was the Colts or maybe something along those lines. But regardless, needless to say, I thought he was going to get one of those three coaching jobs. But like I said, it seemed like he saw the writing on the wall, and maybe he was told from maybe Jerry Jones that, hey, just hang around here for one more year. We're gonna get rid of Kellen Moore, which we'll talk about in just a second, and we'll have you next in line, kind of, for the head coaching job here. And a nice little pay increase where I believe he's going to start making, I believe, $5 million this upcoming year to be the Dallas Cowboys defensive coordinator. I think all of those things together, I think, led to this decision, but a surprising one nonetheless.
Yeah, I definitely think the chances that Dan Quinn is the head coach in 2024 increased to a certain degree. Again, I'm not the biggest anti-McCarthy guy, but based on how this fan base likes to talk about him, I'm sure that there will be no shortage of Dan Quinn 2024 noise this upcoming offseason. But yeah, this is huge for Dallas, honestly. I was stunned he stayed last year, and I'm even more stunned this time around. So, we saw this year just how good this defense could be with continuity. I think they're going to add to this defense. I think that they're going to look at defensive tackle in just certain areas where they can be better. But by and large, the defense was great. Again, the defense has been great in both years under Dan Quinn. And they proved, especially they proved in these playoffs that they can perform in the playoffs. I know they lost against San Francisco, but they were outstanding against San Francisco by and large. And they wore down a bit at the end. That was mostly because the offense didn't hold up their end of the bargain. The defense has a chance to be really good again. They're bringing back pretty much everybody. I know like Van Der Esch is a free agent. There's
Wilson, I believe.
Yeah, Donovan Wilson, and I'm sure they're going to want to bring those guys back. But this is huge for continuity. This is huge for the team, and it's huge just for Dan Quinn getting to coach another year with Micah Parsons. And his dynamic with Parsons is well documented. Parsons is a huge fan of his. And honestly, I think Quinn, part of what's going on here is he could have chosen to be, more selective on what job he takes. Because I don't know about you, I off the top of my head, I'm probably forgetting one or two of the openings, but I don't know that if I'm Dan Quinn, I would touch any of those openings with a 10-foot pole. I mean, I'm surprised Sean Payton wants to go to Denver. If I'm Dan Quinn, are you really going to tie in? Let's mind ourselves another thing here. This is Dan Quinn's second. This would be his second chance at a head coaching opportunity. Most coaches don't get three chances. Um,
Mhm.
he's got to be selective here. And do you really want to go tie your last really good chance as a head coach to uh, Russell Wilson in a franchise that's completely hamstrung by Russ's $250 million contract, or the Texans, who have shown to be a really dysfunctional organization, or the
Kyler Murray,
Cardinals?
who is a mess.
Yeah, like there's like for me personally, like if I'm Dan Quinn, a lot of these head coaching openings aren't super attractive. So I think that's part of I think that played a factor as well.
Yeah, and I just want to go back to kind of the McCarthy conversation real quick because I think, coming off back-to-back 12-win seasons and, coming off a playoff win where you win that game on the road and then you are real competitive in your second round matchup against the 49ers, you would think a head coach like that is, safe. You would think, he has years left on his contract.
Yeah.
He's, coming off those type of seasons, everything's good. But with this organization, you are never good, especially when you have an assistant coach like Dan Quinn right behind you. And I think some of the moves where you get rid of Kellen Moore and there's a lot of pressure on not only Mike McCarthy going into next year, but I think now getting rid of Kellen Moore signals that there's a lot of pressure on Dak Prescott as well. So I just think, all of those things that you touched on, plus that I talked about it a little bit earlier, I think all of those things combined just led to this being, a really not a easy decision, but a decision that makes a lot of sense when you look at the perspective from Dan Quinn.
Yeah, it just makes sense, and it's a big move for Dallas, and it's clear that those guys in that defense love him, um, and relationships and liking the coach aside, the results are hard to argue with. So um, there hasn't, as far as other coaching like assistants, it's hard to imagine unless someone else gets poached somewhere. I'm sure there might be a little bit more shuffling, but it seems like they're bringing back pretty much the same defensive staff, and they're bringing back most of the key players on last year's defense. And we'll see what they do in the draft. And we'll have plenty of time over the next handful of months or handful of weeks to talk draft and draft needs and prospects we like. But yeah, this is a really big move for Dallas. I'm really excited to have Dan Quinn back. And that's just a massive win for Dallas. So, unless you have anything else, there's not too much else to say about it, just because we don't know what the defense is going to look like, personnel wise yet. But I was stunned and happy, both simultaneous
Hmm.
emotions to hear that
Hmm.
Dan Quinn was going to be back. Um, Again, I'd completely just resigned to the fact that he was going to be a head coach somewhere else next year. So um, good on the Cowboys and good on Jerry Jones for making it worthwhile for Dan Quinn to stay, because he's done a tremendous job, and the turnaround he's led on this defense in 2 years has been nothing short of outstanding.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you can't really praise Dan Quinn enough. You talk about a coach who kind of took a year off, after getting fired as a head coach in Atlanta and kind of remade himself, kind of revamped the defense. I remember hearing a quote going into that San Francisco game where Kyle Shanahan had said that, I used to know everything that he was going to do, but now, he's kind of switched his whole defense into, fitting the personnel here in Dallas and just fitting in with today's NFL. And yeah, it's been nothing short of outstanding. And it's going to be, really exciting to see what this defense can do in year three under him. And then, like you said, they're going to address some things, bring some guys back, interchange some guys throughout the defense and, get some new pieces. But I think one thing that I have just kind of come to, well, let's put it this way, I have a lot of confidence in Darren Quinn with no matter what type of guys you give him, he's going to make those players work and get those players, get the best out of those players. So definitely exciting news for this franchise going forward, heading into 2023.
Yeah, and let's get him some more help up front at defensive tackle and and maybe a healthy
Absolutely,
corner or two outside of Trevon Diggs. So we'll
maybe
definitely
a
have plenty of time to
linebacker too.
discuss off-season targets. But yeah, there's gonna be a lot of important decisions coming up here as we get into free agency. But another big decision, it seems like there's a massive shakeup on the Cowboys offensive staff. The contracts, I'll get into the big one in a second, but Joe Philbin, offensive line coach, who, by all accounts, according to biggest voice I've seen that said it is Duke Manyweather, who works with Tyron Smith and Zach Martin, has said that the Cowboys veterans do not like Philbin and what he teaches. So I'm good riddance on that. That's fine. And then Skip Pete, the running backs coach, also was not brought back. And I don't have too much to say on that other than the only thing that we see that came out from Skip Pete this year was that really weird quote he gave about Pollard that kind of
Oh
dampened
yeah,
Pollard, where he was talking about, he can't handle a full load. I forget exactly what he said, but that
yeah.
was really weird.
He was asking
And
out of the
kind of,
game.
that was just weird and didn't need to be said. And I don't think that's a reason he should be fired or anything, but I'm not going to lose any sleep over that either. And then the assistant head coach, Rob
Ray
Price,
Davis, yeah, Rod Davis.
I forget his first name, Price. He apparently he's like McCarthy's buddy that he brought with him for this job. So McCarthy isn't messing around there either. He's been a close confidant of McCarthy's for forever, and he's not being brought back. And then Doug Nussmeier, the quarterback's coach, also not brought back. And then the big one, Kellen Moore mutually agreed to part ways with the Cowboys. I guess we'll start with this. And if you have any other thoughts about the other assistants, go ahead. But how do you
I was
think?
just gonna say,
How do you think this Kellen decision played out? Because I have some thoughts on that.
yeah. So regarding the assistant coaches, I was listening to some local radio this morning, and they kind of threw out this theory of Mike McCarthy and Jerry Jones kind of like, okay, well, you want to get rid of, my guy, like Leon Lett was let go on the
Yeah,
defense,
that's the other one. Yeah.
and he was like, well, that's a Jerry guy. And then McCarthy was like, okay, well, you want to get rid of my guys. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of your guys. And they were kind of just going back and forth. So when you look at guys like Rob Davis, you look at guys like Leon Lett, Philbin, a lot of people, or there's a theory out there that says that Jerry Jones and McCarthy were kind of going back at each other, getting rid of some certain guys and kind of shortening the coaching staff. And there was I guess a number of like 27 assistant coaches or 27 coaches on the Dallas Cowboys staff, where when you look around the league, most teams have between like 15 and 17. So it's just a lot of people think that Jerry was just kind of cleaning things up. It was like, oh, you don't need all of this. We're going to kind of put more of the onus on Mike McCarthy as head coach. So I don't know if there's any merit to that. I think we'll kind of read the tea leaves throughout the offseason and kind of see maybe how that things plays out. And then, some of the people, when he went into his end of season press conference, it was delayed by almost an entire week. And Mike McCarthy had a little bit of a tone to there where he kind of seemed annoyed and didn't seem like he was all the way on board with getting rid of Rob Davis. So that's just that on the assistant coaches. Maybe Mike McCarthy and Jerry Jones were kind of going back and forth there, trading jabs of getting rid of, each other's coaches that they brought in. So that was interesting to me. Now, as far as Kellen Moore goes, my personal thoughts on it, to me, it was Kellen Moore or Dak Prescott. One of them had to go. I think the marriage of them together had kind of reached its ceiling. I don't think they were going anywhere else as far as like development of Dak, and I don't think Kellen Moore was getting any more out of this Cowboys offense or out of the Cowboys quarterback. So I think Kellen Moore at the same time felt that it was time for him to go as well. There's rumblings. Albert Breer, I believe, had a report today that Mike McCarthy and Kellen Moore kind of had, kind of at odds in certain different things. And there was several times during the season where, certain things would happen during a game, and you can kind of see Mike McCarthy's body language just wasn't um, fully on board. Now, as the head coach, to me, I'm saying, well, if you don't like what, your offense coordinator is doing, that should be a conversation that you guys are having throughout the week in preparation. And then that leads me to my other thing where I just don't know how this is going to work out, because if Mike McCarthy is really going to call plays, I don't know if that's the solution either. But I just think this is, in the grand scheme of things, I think this just comes down to the Cowboys front office is going to put a lot more pressure on Mike McCarthy this year. And I think if they don't achieve what the Jones family is setting out to achieve as far as NFC Championship game, Super Bowl, I think we are going to be looking at more massive changes after next season. So I just think that's kind of the way it played out. Kellen Moore was kind of ready to go. Mike McCarthy, I think, was ready for Kellen to go. And, you see how quick he got a job. So obviously he's highly thought of. And I think he's going to have a lot of fun, coaching Justin Herbert out in LA. But as far as the Cowboys go, I just think it was time for them to kind of part ways.
Yeah, I just feel like they'd kind of reached their end of the line. I'll start off and say I'm not the biggest anti-Kellen guy. I am not a part of the people on Cowboys Twitter that wanted him gone and that thought he sucked and was terrible. He was a pretty good offensive coordinator, and the numbers back it up. I'm looking at the graphic that the Chargers socials just posted. As the offensive coordinator in Dallas, the Cowboys were second in total offense, second in yards per game, third in points per game, third in total first downs, third in EPA per play, and fourth and third down percentage. Now, I do think some of that is Dak, because Dallas was 29th in scoring in the Cooper Rush games, and I think they ended up being like second or third this year in scoring, maybe first actually, with Dak. So I'm not going to sit here and say Kellen Moore sucked, but he had his shortcomings. A lot of the curl and hitches that he just a little bland, a little uncreative at times. I read today, he was right around league average in pre-snap motion, right around league average in RPOs, right around league average in play action. Just, excuse me, I'm a little under the weather, so it's that time of year. But he was a good offensive coordinator, but not a great one. And I just think, Dak maybe needed a new voice in his ear and, a new perspective calling the offense. So I don't hate the idea of moving on from Kellen necessarily. But I'm going to sit here and I'm not going to sit here and say Kellen was awful and was trash. He was a pretty good offensive coordinator, and there's a reason he was unemployed for about 34 seconds. And so, and the other thing I was going to say from earlier that I hinted at, that my thoughts on how this played out, I don't know how much I buy the notion that Jerry and McCarthy were having a coach firing each other's guys. But I do think that there's a little something to how quickly Kellen was hired, where I think this was mutual. I don't know that he was fired. I think, they both just kind of saw the writing on the wall and said, let's just move on. And he'd been working on, like, the Chargers didn't just all of a sudden, have a contract ready for Kellen Moore. I'm sure he was talking to the Chargers all week. And it had just kind of run its course. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and bash Kellen. But yeah, he definitely had his shortcomings, and there was big moments where, he definitely his scheme seemed to struggle and reach a ceiling at big moments in the playoffs, like we saw in, both of their last two playoff losses. So, but yeah, I do think, I don't think Kellen was fired per se. I think he was more just, and he saw the writing on the wall and said, I'm gonna figure something else out. Let's just part ways. And he landed on his feet quite nicely in, I was going to say San Diego, but LA with the Chargers and Justin Herbert. So good on Kellen. He landed on his feet nicely. And I personally think he did a pretty good job here. Especially when you look at what this offense had. He had about 1.5 decent pass catchers, out at receiver this year, and an offensive line that was in flux and at time in shambles last year. For all the circumstances, I think Kellen did a pretty good job. And I've said it. And last thing, I've said it before. I'll say it again. I cannot wait to see the offense Kellen calls in Los Angeles versus the one he called here, because I'm very firmly in the department of the one that you see mentioned thrown around Twitter all the time is the calls coming from inside the house, where he's almost neutered a bit as a play caller here, and he's told to run a certain offense, and then he's basically given a boundary on what he's allowed to do and what he's not, and he has to work within those boundaries. I'm excited to see how different his scheme looks in LA, because I definitely think there's some merit to the fact that that the Joneses have a say in the offensive philosophy here.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I found frustrating for Kellen Moore during his time here is that it seemed like always during the first half of the season, there's all sorts of creativity, motion, things that we hadn't really seen from this Cowboys offense. And then by week 8 and 9, things kind of started going south. And then once you run into a really good defense in the playoffs, the offense just couldn't quite get there. Now, whether that was on the talent that he had, as far as you start with the quarterback, you start with the weapons, the receiver, the running backs. I don't know exactly where that falls, but I think we're going to get a pretty clear answer this upcoming year on kind of what was the actual issue, and I think that's what the Cowboys are kind of trying to get to the bottom of. And I think I heard a report saying that the Chargers had I guess requested to speak with Kellen Moore like the week prior, so last week. And that's kind of how that deal came along so quickly, which I think, like you said, the writing was on the wall from I think around the league. The Cowboys had kind of started, putting things out there. Mike McCarthy didn't really do Kellen Moore any favors in his press conference, where he didn't really he basically said all coaches will be evaluated, didn't really commit. And at the end of the press conference, he said that Dan Quinn would be back in that same vein. So, yeah, I just think the writing was on the wall, and the Chargers were the team to jump out there and get him immediately. And I am interested to see kind of how he does out there in LA with Herbert, because I think Herbert has more, I would say, arm talent. And can make some throws that Dak cannot make. So I think that's going to be a huge thing for him. And I think, I think part of that could be, I think some of the differences that you might see up over there in LA might be just related to that as well. So I think there's a lot of fascinating aspects of this that's going to start playing out during the next season. So I'm actually really looking forward to, seeing, what kind of answers we get, and then how the Cowboys move from what from what answers they do get. So I think it's all interesting and fascinating.
Yeah, I'd kind of thought after hearing McCarthy's presser, I was like, Kellen's gone, isn't he? Just based on McCarthy's tone, that was weird. So, the timing was also kind of funny. I thought it was very,
very Cowboys think they're slick.
some savvy PR work by the Cowboys to news dump that literally in the middle of Championship Sunday. So,
after
I did think the timing of the timing of the announcement was pretty funny to me as well. But going forward, moving on a little bit from Kellen Moore, going forward. So again, the rumor is, I don't know how, this has been reported, and I guess we'll see exactly what the plan is. It's hard to say because we don't completely know what the plan is yet. They're interviewing offensive coordinators right now. It was reported today that they're going to interview with Panthers running back coach Jeff Nixon. I'm not going to sit here and act like I know a lot about Jeff Nixon. So I mean that's that until I hear anything else about it, and we hear anything else about it. I'm not going to sit here and comment on Jeff Nixon. I am a little bit suspicious that this is just a little bit of a checking the Rooney Rule box, which who knows? Because right away we heard Brian Schottenheimer was mentioned as an offensive coordinator, but above all that, it sounds like McCarthy's going to call the plays, And I think Mike McCarthy knows this is my legacy. This is my last best shot to win another Super Bowl and do well with this franchise. I want it to be on my own terms. And we'll see what the plan is. I heard an interesting discussion about this on the Locked On Cowboys podcast, where Landon McCool was basically saying, we need to know, like, is this a change in philosophy, or is McCarthy going to be calling from the same menu that Kellen's been calling from? Because this is a change in philosophy and terminology. And I kind of agree with what Landon was saying, where this kind of sets Dak back, because Dak's been in this system for 7 years. He has a complete mastery of it just from knowing the terminology and, getting them in the right calls and whatnot. That would almost set Dak back if we were starting from scratch with, mind you, the West Coast offense is that McCarthy ran in Green Bay is very like timing based and very complicated and detailed. Like that's a lot. But again, it's hard to comment on that without knowing exactly what the plan is. But I guess, it seemed like there was some tension with McCarthy and Kellen. And it's kind of goes back to how dysfunctional this whole franchise is, because Kellen was not McCarthy's guy. When McCarthy was hired, it was like, oh, by the way, here's your play caller. Like he's staying.
You just kind of had to eat it.
Yeah, it's backwards. That whole thing is backwards. And I'm not, and I was happy that they kept Kellen around, but regardless of who the coach involved is, that's backward when you hire a new head coach and you say, hey, I know you're setting up your staff, but we already have this offensive coordinator here for you. So I'm not surprised at all that there was this tension between Kellen and McCarthy, because Kellen wasn't a McCarthy guy. Kellen was given to McCarthy. Whether Mike wanted him or not, we don't know, but that's not surprising at all to know that there was tension between the two. And, frankly, I'm not stunned to hear that that McCarthy's going to take over the play calling, just because there was some weird quotes in the media throughout the year about that as well, where McCarthy would make some comments here and there, and you wondered what that tension was like. And I think McCarthy just wants to go down, with his hands on the steering wheel.
Yeah, and I think when you talk in terms of play calling, I heard Todd Archer basically said that he hasn't personally been told that McCarthy is going to call plays, but I think that is an interesting aspect, and I think we'll have a pretty good idea by who they hire as offensive coordinator on kind of what direction they're going to go in. My personal opinion, I don't see McCarthy changing the entire playbook, because I know he's talked about continuity pretty much the entire time he's been here. And I think he might sprinkle in some of his terminology. But then, there's also been rumors through the entire 3 years he's been here is that Mike McCarthy doesn't want to install his offense. And, he doesn't want to go through that whole process of doing that. So I just think there's so many different layers and, fascinating layers that are going to play out, with this offensive coaching hire, and see who they actually go with. Like I said, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know a lot about this Carolina's running backs coach. But I do think in the initial tweet where it said that the Cowboys are going to be interviewing him, they were saying, how much success he had with Deontay Foreman and Chuba Hubbard and McCaffrey over there. And I think that if, they do end up making that hire, I think we're going to a philosophy that I know you love, is running the football a whole bunch and, using play action off of that. So like I said, that's going to be interesting to see kind of how that plays out.
Yeah, exactly how I feel about establishing the run. Exactly how I feel about that. I've voiced that very clearly. So, yeah, to that, and kind of ironically in that same vein, the one other name we have heard is Brian Schottenheimer, and that would be my personal hell as a guy that just hates antiquated establishing the run offense, because
he does.
I forget where I heard this, but I heard someone phrase it as his play calling was so great in Indianapolis that he made Andrew Luck retire. And then when he was in Seattle with the Seahawks ran it more than anybody in the entire league, just constantly. So Schottenheimer is about as big of an establish the run guy as you'll find in the league. And I think that would be a tremendous step back if they bring Brian Schottenheimer in. Again, I think McCarthy's going to call the plays regardless. And, it's hard to say because we don't know a lot yet. Like we don't know who they're going to bring in, but I do know this: they do need to get these OC and QB coach hires right, and get with Dak and figure this out. Because look, like it or not, Dak's the quarterback of this team for the foreseeable future. He's on this big contract. He isn't going anywhere. Barring just a complete collapse from Dak, a la, I don't know, Carr or Wentz, where it's like, all right, we have this big guy, this quarterback on this big contract for the foreseeable future. Barring something like that, Dak isn't going anywhere for the next handful of years. So that's just the reality of things. So they need to get someone in here that can work with him and build an offensive philosophy that works for Dak. And then beyond that, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks, is you need to get him some actual weapons besides CD, because what they had this year wasn't good enough. So there's honestly, given all the outgoing free agents Dallas has and some big roster decisions to make, and now we have an OC and a QB coach opening, there's a lot of big decisions coming up this offseason for the Cowboys. So while the season may be over, Corey, I think you and I are going to have plenty to talk about over the next month or two, between draft talk and coaching hires and free agency, which I know Stephen Jones refuses to participate in, but you never know. So there's a lot of big decisions coming for this franchise. And honestly, these decisions are going to impact the direction of the franchise for the foreseeable future, because there's so many, there's so much reshuffling on the offensive staff, and they have a lot of outgoing free agents to make decisions on. So we'll see where this goes, but yeah, a lot of interesting stuff going on in Cowboys land.
And one more name I wanted to throw out there in the offensive coordinator search that I've kind of heard, which kind of intrigues me, is the current Eagles quarterback coach, Brian Johnson. He has familiarity with Dak from being his quarterback coach at Mississippi State.
Okay.
So that's a guy that's interesting that I've heard thrown out. I believe it was either John Machota or Todd Archer. One of those two had that name, along with like 7 other names. So that's one name to keep an eye out on. Now, obviously the Eagles are in the Super Bowl, and I don't know if Brian Johnson's necessarily looking to leave that situation, but he has had a lot of success with Jalen Hurts, and now he has that familiarity already with Dak from college. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this hire, and this is actually a point that I heard this morning too that I wasn't really thinking of, is that how the job security of Mike McCarthy might play into a guy making a decision to leave his current situation to come here. Because, if you're coming in here as a Mike McCarthy guy and then Mike McCarthy is done after 1 year, is it really worth leaving your current situation? So I think that's pretty interesting. And then my last point is that I think, when you talk about Dak being the quarterback of the foreseeable future, I definitely think that is the most likely scenario. But I think the Cowboys are going to kind of tip their hand at that decision when, in terms of freeing up cap space, if they're restructuring Dak's contract this year. I think that will say a lot with how they feel about him long term, because I think it's after one of the next 2 years, there is a way to kind of finagle their way out of it. So I think that's just something to keep an eye out on. Now, I'm not saying, like I said, the most likely scenario is Dak's going to be here long term, but I do think there's a couple of tales that will tell us that this offseason for sure.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of big decisions to be made this offseason. And I feel like the number one goal, the last thing I'll say is the number one goal of this offseason is to make the offense more Dak friendly. Get him weapons, and bring in a staff that can get the most out of Dak. And I don't think there should be any other goal this offseason than that. And I think their offseason moves in terms of coaching hires, in terms of free agency, trades, draft, I think all of that should point towards making this thing more Dak friendly. Because frankly, this year it wasn't. And Dak dragged a pretty subpar offensive cast to the divisional round and to some pretty impressive offensive numbers. So I wonder what this thing could look like if they actually if they actually made this thing Dak friendly and made it, and had an advanced offensive scheme, and again, not hitting on Kellen. Kellen was solid. Again, we talked about this, but it was a lot of hitches, just a lot. It was a lot of the old Jason Garrett style stuff. So, goal number one: make this thing more Dak friendly, because I think that's the best path for this team going forward. And then I guess the last thing, and then one more thing I'll say is kind of interesting is with Kellen gone and Nussmeier gone, there's almost no one left over from the Jason Garrett group.
Love it.
So this is it's basically a complete turnover now. So a lot of interesting stuff going on. But we'll be covering it all over the next couple of months. Unless you got anything else, Corey, you can get on out of here. Thank you guys for listening. Make sure to check out everything going on at the Dallas Sports Fanatic, at Cowboys News 365, at Dallas_Fanatic, both of those on Twitter and Instagram, at DAL Cowboys Fanatic. You can get me on Twitter at Nate_Sanch77. You can get Corey on Twitter at the Mr. Douglas, 2 S's. Thank you guys for listening to the Silver and Blue podcast. We will talk to you guys next time.